May the words of my mouth and the meditations of each heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You want to know what my favorite line of the creed is? Of course you do, right? He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. I used to dread that part of the liturgy. It used to just kind of give me the creeps when we got to that line. I think the idea of judgment in general makes us uneasy, and for a few good reasons. Maybe we've been judged harshly by someone in our life, or maybe we've been told that God's judgment is going to get us. Or maybe we've heard of some judges who were just real pieces of work, and that makes us mistrust the idea that justice is achievable at all. How we think of judgment and justice has a lot to do with who is doing the judging. I want to tell you the tale of two different judges. Back in 2007, a 15-year-old girl named Hillary Transu, she made a parody account on MySpace to criticize her assistant principal. Now, MySpace was a social media platform before any of the platforms we have now, and I think it's completely extinct. So just hang with me, it's a social media thing. So she makes this parody account, makes fun of her assistant principal. A few days later, knock, knock, it's the police at the door. They were arresting her, and further bad news for her, she would be appearing before a guy named Mark Chivarella, aka Mr. Zero Tolerance. Her mom accompanied her to the courthouse, where they were met by a court official that demanded that they sign a bunch of documents and that they do that quickly, or the judge would be even more angry than he already is. And one of the papers that Hillary's mother unknowingly signed waived her right to an attorney. And living up to his Mr. Zero Tolerance moniker, Judge Chivarella sent Hillary to juvenile detention for 3 months for this crime. But Judge Chivarella didn't send Hillary to a normal juvenile detention facility. He couldn't have, because he had had the state-run facility shut down. Not because he didn't think that kids should be locked up, mind you, but because he preferred to send children to the for-profit facilities that he was part invested in. Places that would give him a little kickback for every kid that he sent. So Hillary did her time for the egregious crime of posting something stupid on the internet while a teenager, and Judge Chivarella went on to send 2,300, that's 2,300 children, some as young as 8 years old, to these for-profit juvenile prisons. His friends made money, he made money, everybody was happy. Well, everybody that mattered, anyway. He was able to launder about $3 million of taxpayer money into his own bank account via this Kids for Cash scam. That's what NPR calls it, Kids for Cash, if you want to look it up. But he didn't get away with it indefinitely. He was eventually caught, and he's presently serving a 28-year sentence for his crimes against those children. You can contrast the story of Judge Chivarella with that of Judge Abby Abinati. Judge Abinati was the first tribal woman admitted to the State Bar of California, and she served in San Francisco as a Superior Court judge for decades. The American Bar Association recently interviewed her for her work in trauma-informed negotiations and trauma-informed proceedings in the courtroom. And in that interview, she recounted this story of presiding over juvenile court. And I am going to read you her story, so I'm quoting. I once had a kid before me, some 11-year-old, and he'd gotten into a school fight. They locked him up over the weekend. He was just a scrawny little kid in juvenile hall in San Francisco. And his whole family, his uncles, his father, everybody was there on Monday morning. They had charged him with some felony. He'd been locked up 3 to 4 days by then, and when the DA talked about the charges, he was all heated up and he wanted to throw the book at the kid. I said to the DA, "Okay, let me explain something to you. This is not a felony. And he isn't even tall enough to ride the teacup rides at Disneyland." So then I asked the kid to stand up and said, "Look behind you. Your father's here, your uncles are here, and none of them spent the weekend in jail. So the next time you get a really stupid idea, go to the principal's office and call them and ask them what you should do, because obviously they know what to do, and you obviously do not know what to do. I'm going to send you home, and I never, ever want to see you again." And I didn't. I never did see him come back into my court. End quote. How we think of judgment has a lot to do with who is the judge. What the judge values will make a big difference in the way that they execute justice. Mr. Zero Tolerance Mark Chivarella valued money over children and their futures. And Judge Abby Abinati valued keeping a family together over keeping the rule book. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. If Jesus is meant to be the ultimate judge, then to know what that judgment might look like would require to know what Jesus values. What is it that Jesus values? In today's gospel, Jesus goes up a mountain and he sits down. Up a mountain and sits down. If that sounds familiar to you, it's because it's an archetype in the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, we just heard a passage from Micah wherein God sits down among the mountains and their hills as a jury, and God pronounces judgment on God's people. And that judgment is summarized in the last line of that reading. "And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God?" I don't think it's an accident that today's gospel gives us the detail that Jesus went up the mountain and sat down. This is not only the position that would be taken by a rabbi, but it's the position that we see God in that courtroom scene that we heard in Micah. This is the position that would be taken by a judge about to pronounce a judgment. And what is that judgment? "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will see God. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." In these Beatitudes, we hear Jesus' values. We are hearing about what Jesus values, and that will determine Jesus' trustworthiness as a coming judge. Jesus says that the kingdom of God, the reign of God, does not belong to the people that the world considers high value. Jesus turns the values of the social world, values that typically favor the strong and the violent, the privileged and the powerful, values that so often end in corruption and despair. In the Beatitudes, Jesus turns the world's upside-down values right side up. I don't know about you, but when I'm trying to picture Jesus talking to a crowd of people, my brain goes to those 1950s, 1960s cinema portrayals of stories from the Bible. So it's like a whole bunch of middle-class actors in biblical timey robes, you know? I picture it like it's a scene out of a classic movie, and that does not even begin to capture the precarity of the situation that the people were in that Jesus was talking to. The truth is that the social landscape of the Roman-occupied ancient Near East had no middle-class dudes in theater robes. Less than 2% of the people in the Roman Empire owned any kind of property or wealth, and everybody else was barely scraping by from day to day. Folks were subsistence farmers. There were a lot of slaves, a lot of indentured servants. Working folks had to pay an estimated 88% of their incomes as tribute to Rome. We actually know that fishermen were paying around 88% of their catch to the Roman emperor. Tax collectors would come along to help collect those taxes, that would bring officers, would bring soldiers along with them to help collect those taxes. So the tenuous Pax Romana, the peace that was kept by Rome, was kept by the constant threat of imperial violence. And the Beatitudes are spoken in that environment. The Beatitudes are a values statement that the people that God treasures are not exactly the people with all the treasures. The Beatitudes, they're a values statement, but they are also a promise. A promise that the powers of this world, overfed emperors and crooked judges, self-loving scoundrels, armed men with their heavy boots on the necks of the innocent, the powers in that time and in this time and in every time that corrupt and denigrate what God has created and beheld and called good and very good. The powers that attempt to destroy that goodness, they're being put on notice. They are getting their summons to appear before the judge. In that time and in every time, the Beatitudes are a rebuke to the evil powers, telling them that they have been judged and found wanting, and their time is drawing nigh. The time's up. The oppressed will be liberated, the hungry will be fed, those who mourn will be comforted. There are no such thing as low-value people in the reign of God. The low-value people of the world are not cursed by God. Jesus says that they are blessed. In the Beatitudes, we see that God has a preferential option for the nobodies of this world. They will see God. I do have two quick words of caution regarding the Beatitudes. They aren't a checklist, and they don't give us a timeline. Some of us are so conditioned to try to avoid judgment that we'll look at things like the Beatitudes and we'll make it a checklist of things to do. Like, if I can just act perfectly, nothing bad will ever happen to me. As we say in Texas, that ain't it. I remember thinking as a kid, I needed to try to figure out a way to get my parents to take me to more funerals, right? Because God blesses the people who mourn. And I wasn't sure how I was going to get there, but I'll tell you that that ain't it. Just so you know, the Beatitudes are written in the indicative tense, not the imperative tense. They're descriptive, not prescriptive. Descriptive of what God is doing and is going to do. Not yet another set of boxes for us to check to try to make ourselves more #blessed. But the other caution is that when we look at the Beatitudes, we can start to get the sense that, oh, that sounds nice and all, but tell me about this, they will. When is that? They will be comforted. They will inherit the earth. They will be filled. They will receive mercy. You may be thinking, preacher, do you even watch the news? If it hasn't happened by now, doesn't that mean that it's probably not going to happen? I've come to trust that not only will it happen, but it already is happening. Some great day in the future? Yes. But also here and now. Some great final day? Absolutely. But also today. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was fond of quoting a line from a sermon that was preached in the 1800s by, I think, a Unitarian minister, but it's become more famous as a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. The quote is, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. When I hear those they will statements in the Beatitudes, I am reminded of that arc that is bending. I'm reminded that things are being actively redeemed by God when I say he will come in glory to judge the living and the dead. And I am reminded that we, the church, get to participate in that bending of the arc towards justice. It does not depend solely on us. God is dreaming about this world, and God is making this world. So does it depend on us? No, but neither are we free to refrain from building the world that God is dreaming about, from making the Beatitudes a reality in real time. Jesus is a trustworthy judge, and his judgments are being rendered as we speak. And knowing that keeps me from the complacency that comes with the despair of looking at some of the things that are happening in our world. And knowing that gives me the energy I need to work for the kind of world that is described by Jesus when he goes up the mountain and he sits down to pronounce his good judgment. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. Amen.